All right, well, hello everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for this special webcast on the future of workplaces in financial services. This is a special event. It's part of a two-part series on corporate culture and financial services, and we're pleased to be co-sponsoring it with the Financial Services Culture Board. They're an organization based in London whose mission is very much aligned with ours. Since their founding in 2015, they've been working to help raise the standards of organizational behavior, competence, and culture in the industry. That is also our mission at the American College Maguire Center for Ethics and Financial Services, where we aim to raise the level of ethical behavior in financial services through our research and education. I'm Azish Filabi, Executive Director of the Ethics Center and an Associate Professor of Business Ethics here at the college. Our audience and panelists today include people and companies both in the US and the UK. So we will hear a global and comparative perspective on the evolving culture challenges in the industry. And you might be wondering why the Ethics Center is hosting a webcast on the future of workplaces and how this topic relates to our work. And I think that you'll find today in our panel discussion that many of the culture themes that we touch on are highly related to ethical behavior. At its core, ethics is about how you treat other people. And when it comes to business, the company's culture often establishes the framework through which stakeholders in business are treated. And that includes employees, clients, business partners, and the general public in the system. And it's clear that the pandemic has changed and will continue to fundamentally shift our culture. And that's what we are here today to discuss. So here's our plan for the 1-hour webcast. After I briefly introduce our panelists, we will hear a 15-minute research presentation from Jenny Robinson, the Senior Behavioral Scientist from the Financial Services Culture Board. And she'll summarize the recent culture survey and focus group findings relating to companies in the industry. After the presentation, I'll moderate a discussion with 3 leaders at firms in the US. Our panelists are Cheri Lytle, Managing Director and Head of Wealth Management Advice and Strategy at JPMorgan Chase, Noreen Beaman, Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of Orion Advisor Solutions, and Rachel Fichter, Global Head of Talent and Leadership at S&P Global. In the interest of time, I won't go into detailed backgrounds on these accomplished professionals and suggest that you please check out their bios on our website. So with all that said, Jenny, over to you for the presentation, please.
Thank you, Azish. My name is Jenny Robinson, and I'm a Senior Behavioural Scientist in the FSCB Insights team. For those of you who are not familiar with the FSCB, formerly known as the Banking Standards Board, we are an independent membership organisation, which for the last 6 years has been conducting an assessment of culture and behaviour across banking, and since 2020 across the financial services industry, after we extended our membership to all financial services firms. Our assessment provides firms with an independent picture of their individual cultures, enabling them to benchmark themselves against sector peers and to track progress over time. You can find more detail about our survey assessment methodology on fscb.org.uk. Today, I'm going to share insights on the future of workplaces gained from the FSCB surveys from the last 2 years and a qualitative study from 2021. Since March 2020, there have been huge non-discretionary changes in the world of work. As firms and their people adapted, conversations quickly started to turn to, so what next for the workplace? The FSCB sought to bring together member firms to consider this issue from an organisational culture perspective. We initially undertook a review of broad perspectives on the future of work, but found little evidence to support the very many predictions of how the future of workplaces would look. It was all very much crystal ball gazing. So we undertook an evidence-based approach, including the industry-wide results from the 2020 FSCB employee survey run across our member firms, which had around 70,000 UK-based responses. And we also undertook a bespoke qualitative inquiry conducted through semi-structured interviews with 27 employees from 4 participating member firms. We chose to focus our project on what we could learn from the changes in workplaces induced by the pandemic to consider how these might usefully inform future working models from an organisational culture perspective. In our approach, we were agnostic around what models organisations might wish to implement after work from home where possible restrictions were lifted. So what did we find? Most, but not all of our respondents from our 2020 survey worked from home during and after the March 2020 UK-wide lockdown. Although most people changed work location, it wasn't universal. Most of our branch-based employees were on site throughout. 66% of our respondents worked on site before March 2020. And by September 2020, that was still only 25%, despite a lifting of general UK restrictions on movement and office working. Before the pandemic, only around 21% worked from home, but by September 2020, that was at 71%. Before the pandemic, 10% split their time between between home and office. But in September 2020, that was down to 3%. As I said, our on-site respondents were primarily branch-based. 71% of branch-based respondents were on-site throughout the pandemic, rising to 81% by September 2020. In investment banking, the highest proportion of on-site workers was in markets, which was around 12% during the lockdown period, rising to 25% by September 2020. But global banking, including M&A employees, were almost universally home-based, with only around 1% working on site, both during and after the lockdown period. In addition to our core 36 questions about aspects of organisational culture, in 2020 we asked 5 specific questions related to the pandemic and analysed these through the lens of working arrangements. As you can see from the overwhelming sea of green on this slide, an overwhelming majority of respondents were positive about their organisation's crisis responses across all 5 of these measures. You can see that the scores on the wellbeing questions were lower than on other questions, and that the line management scores were more positive overall. Employees who worked from home across all questions were more positive about their organisation's responses than employees who were working on site. When we ran regression equations controlling for other demographic factors such as ethnicity and gender, they were particularly more positive on concepts of fairness, but also on senior leadership and on customer centricity. Across our core 36 questions, there were upticks in almost all of our core survey questions in our 2020 survey relative to previous years. We think of this as being a kind of COVID bounce, because these fell back again during 2021, eradicating around 50% of the gains from 2020. Moving on to our qualitative study, we undertook a study involving 4-member firms where we interviewed 27 middle managers using semi-structured format. We chose middle managers because they were able to see both above themselves to the big strategic piece, but also they were themselves managers of managers. We interviewed a minimum of 6 subject matter experts from a consistent range of business areas: risk, HR, commercial, retail banking, and IT and change across the 4-member firms. 2 of the firms were very large, 1 medium and 1 small, so that we could understand a broad cross-section. We used a grounded theory-based approach to analyse the over 800 comments that we got from those interviews, to systematically surface themes rather than fish for desired responses. It meant that we ended up having key findings that were related to themes that weren't prompted in the semi-structured interviews. In terms of the questions that we asked about their pandemic experiences so that we could try to understand the past better, to better recognise cultural threats in the future. So our most future-gazing question was, what would need to change for the current working arrangements to be sustainable long-term? We had 63 key findings across 15 themes. Azish has got me on notice not to talk for too long, so I'm only going to touch on a selection of them. There's a summary report on the FSCB website for those who'd like a wee bit more information. The first theme that I'd like to talk about is responsiveness. In general, the pandemic response was really positive in terms of adapting to new ways of working, responding to customer needs that were evolving at pace, and adapting quickly to things like IT changes, being able to work online. One of our respondents said, once we're faced with a problem, you start finding solutions. In banking, we want to help people. We realised that our customers were at a point where we needed to demonstrate that we were behind them. The desire to do this takes over. So in terms of their ability to respond to evolving employee and customer needs, there was improved perception of that amongst their employees. People were quickly redeployed and reskilled into new roles that perhaps never existed, or into new ways of doing the roles that they'd been doing for a long time. One of the key things in this was faster decision-making and delivery at pace in evolving circumstances. And that's the next area I'd like to talk about, a wee bit about decision-making. It got faster. In general, processes became faster and less bureaucratic, while still performing in terms of risk management. You can see that, for example, in the past, if I had drafted a paper or had a suggestion, it would have been taken in by one of my colleagues or by a boss. So there's more exposure at my level to decision-making, which means different people getting involved in the conversations, making things happen faster. So necessities driven decisions to be made faster, and decision-making processes changed as a result. However, there are still slow and complex processes, and it's not clear yet whether there are uncrystallised risks in new ways of working, or that are evolving as these new models persist. I spoke earlier about line managers. Line managers are kind of our squeezed people in the middle. They've really seen an evolution away from being purely task-focused to being more than a manager. You can see that in this first quote. I was there as more than a manager. It's not just about tasks. How are they getting on at home? How can we support and help them with things? Our qualitative research bore out many of the findings from our survey in 2020, that line managers really were making it happen in dispersed and unfamiliar working environments. However, as primary agents and sort of creators of culture, do managers have the capacity and the capability to perform these dual roles? How do you maintain that flexibility and focus on what matters when you're not in the middle of a pandemic? And how could or will line managers' skill sets around people management be maintained or sustained in a post-pandemic world? Is it possible to actually sustain that level of focus on well-being in individual circumstance when the pendulum kind of swings back to BAU activities? One of the key things that we touched upon with our middle managers was their concerns around learning and development, particularly for junior colleagues, new entrants and graduates. There was a feeling that the informal learning didn't work very well during the pandemic, both in terms of building connections and confidence and being able to access help and in-the-moment coaching. For example, this first quote here says, imagine your first job and you get trained through a computer. If you're doing something the first time, who do you turn to get reassurance and in that moment coaching? So for junior colleagues, there's a perception that they do need to be close to people to learn how things are done. And they need to experience the work and the culture firsthand to really be able to understand it. That lack of reassurance, face-to-face supervision and coaching really felt like a deficit. But despite that, there was an experience within more formal learning environments, for example, in contact centres where there's a lot more specific formalised training, that actually that had worked really well and the onboarding was working really well for people within those environments. So it's not all a doom and gloom picture on learning and development. It is possible, it just needs an awful lot of structure. So if we turn our minds to inclusion, some of the elements of diversity and inclusion really did improve due to changes in the ways of working. But some people have continued to feel excluded. So for example, there was less localization. New people were getting involved in meetings, new people were building new networks. There were advantages in not having to travel to go to meetings. We can have all the key people in the room and we don't need to try and organize it in a really, really, really long, sort of extremely difficult way. However, the narrative of everything's changed, what's it all going to be like in the future, for some people just isn't true. For some of them, it's the same as it always has been, particularly for branch-based employees, and that can leave them feeling really excluded from the prevailing narratives. one of the last things that's really difficult is how hard it is to build social capital, those sort of informal networks and connections that are absolutely imperative to your career development, your learning, and in some ways, your enjoyment of work. That can all be really difficult, particularly for new joiners, for people new to business, or for people new to a team. So that building social collateral can be really difficult in a dispersed and hybrid environment. So how can we capture those gains of more people involved in more conversations at the same time as being able to offset that risk that people aren't equally able to build social capital? Also, in terms of inclusion, before the pandemic, very few organisations would have cared whether their people lived in a home of multiple occupancy, in a multi-generational household, or anything else. It's not so much the case when there's 6 people each sharing a workspace and they're all having the same confidential conversations in front of each other. So suddenly, businesses are interested in where their employees live and under what circumstances. However, at the same time, the people who are making decisions about future working models do tend to be more senior and are doing so from a position of relative socioeconomic privilege. Still, individual experiences do matter. For example, we have a situation in the first quote here where somebody said, every individual has an individual set of difficulties. We've got an individual who was incredible at his job, but was relying on lip reading. Can't do lip reading on conference calls. So we have to be considerate of what people's individual experiences are and make sure that future models do take into account those individual needs. That sounds very complicated. I mean, how do you make that fair? And that's kind of the last point that we had from our qualitative study. Organisations are going to need to understand the importance of fairness in developing their new working models as they become permanent rather than reaction to circumstance. For example, one of our respondents said, employees have been asked what they'd find ideal and what they want. So they are being engaged. Organisations are listening. However, if you look at the first quote, my boss is saying that when we go back to the office, we'll all be in the office all at the same time. So we'll end up doing whatever the leadership team's doing when they're in the office. So going forward, how can firms find a fair balance between flexibility, business and individual needs? How can we ensure there's equality of access to power and decision-making when leaders choose their return to work arrangements? And how can we most usefully consult employees on future models when their workplace preferences just aren't static? They change with circumstance, they change with life stage. It's a moving picture. So looking forward, what does that mean? Well, we're still in a state of flux. In recent conversations with our member firms, they indicated that new ways of working are still transitioning, that there are issues that are emerging with respect to line managerial capacity and capability in the longer term. There are difficulties in encouraging employees back into workplaces which they've been absent from for so long, and a very mixed and really quite badly evidenced picture on productivity. There are other issues that may take longer to become apparent or for which we don't have accurate or even adequate measurements, including on fairness, on equity and in inclusion. The FSCB continues to work with firms to help them understand the challenges and to measure some of these aspects of organisational culture, as well as enabling members to exchange their knowledge and share good practices. So with respect to the future of workplaces, it really is a case of continue to watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That was really interesting. And I appreciated so much about that presentation, which we'll get into more detail in our discussion, but particularly the roller coaster on your last slide, because certainly it is, we're also on this roller coaster. So I apologize if you hear any noise in my background and trying to navigate this new normal. So we're going to turn into the panel discussion now and talk about some of the themes that you raised in your research and the survey findings and explore it from a comparative perspective and understand what our leaders are seeing here at US firms. And I think the first question I'd like to start the panel off with is just where we are today. Where are your firms as they're considering their return to work plans at a high level? We are seeing, in particular, our marketing team did a really brief survey right in preparation for today's webcast. And about 50% of respondents prefer hybrid work environments. And then there's a mix of those who prefer working from home versus working in the office. So could you all please share your observations, including any experiences from your own workplaces? And Cheri, we'll start with you with this first question.
Speaking of workplaces, I actually had a hard time getting on video today. So one of the things that came out of this is we've become much more patient with our work environments. Speaking from JP Morgan, we are actively getting people back. We are a client-facing company, so our branches have been open the entire time. So for the rest of the workforce, we're definitely pushing hard to get people back, but hard in a way where we're still allowing the hybrid situation for people to get, and keep the lifestyle, keep the whatever routine they had, but also get back to more normal, if you will, environment. I mean, I've probably been in a hybrid working model for the last 15 years. I'm home today, but I'm usually in the office. So we're still wanting people to work smart, but definitely trying to get back in the office.
Great. Thank you, Cheri. Noreen, what's the current state for you all now?
So at Orion, we're primarily a technology company, a fintech company. So we have different needs for different employees. So we're creating an opportunity to show flexibility. So we'll continue hybrid. You can really work anywhere. We expand our geographic reach by doing that. But more importantly, we're starting to look at ways we can come back purposely. How do we get the teams together so they can share and be together? I did love the one piece on the research. We're just coming in when the leaders are in. That is not the plan, but really allowing the teams some flexibility. So we're, again, and the one thing I think with the roller coaster too, is that we're not making any firm decisions because every time we've done that, change has to happen. So we're still in that kind of flex moment as well.
Excellent. Thank you. And Rachel, what's your experience currently?
Yeah, so actually we announced, I think it was maybe a couple of weeks ago, that as of today, we are officially moving to optional work from home and are beginning to implement what we call our anchor flex model. So anchor days are the days that we want people to be in the office to enhance collaboration and connectivity. And flex days are the days that people can work either from home or in the office. And every team gets to decide how many days they want to have anchor days and what those days are. So there's a lot of flexibility and there's a lot of focus on making sure that the people who are actually going to be impacted have a say in how it's going to play out. Now, I would also add that we are a very global organization and our teams are generally, many of our teams are never work co-located. And so we were used to video calls for several years. And I think we've proven that, we can be highly effective and highly productive from home. And of course, we don't want to lose that as well. So we want to give a lot of flexibility. So that's pretty much the model that we're going to be moving to around the globe.
Great. So really interesting to hear from 3 different types of financial services entities and a range of responses and a range of footprints in terms of geography as well. So I want to explore this a bit with you each as we think about, we'll start with the lingering effects of the pandemic. One of the things that we heard in the Financial Services Culture Board report is that there was a COVID bounce in employee sentiment. And I thought this was really interesting because there were gains across all indicators of culture in 2020, particularly among people working from home. Whereas later in 2021, the data went back to the baseline as kind of a new normal set in. So I wanted to explore this nuance with you all as panelists. And, as I view it, one way to think about this data is that perhaps the crisis can encourage collaboration, but then it might be harder to sustain that for the long term. And the data from the Culture Board indicates that there were improvements in decision-making, improvements in responsiveness, particularly around administrative matters. And people also seem to have been responding to clients' needs more efficiently. So some productivity gains perhaps. But then on the other hand, informal learning and mentoring opportunities took a hit, and there was challenges to sustaining all of these elements in general. So I'm curious whether you see similar dynamics within the industry here. And if you are seeing these dynamics, how are you seeing the leaders respond to it specifically? So Noreen, if I could start with you on this question.
No, great, thank you. I think I totally believe in the COVID bounce. When we first went home, we didn't all know we could do this. And what we proved is we can. And that flexibility is important to our workforces. I think that would go pretty much without saying now that going back 100% in any direction will be difficult for employers in attracting talent and keeping talent. But one of the challenges, and I think this is why we've seen the challenge, is we created so much productivity. There also wasn't much else to do in that first year of the pandemic, right? People were locked down. So now all of a sudden they're not leaving their desks. They're not shutting off their computer. Just because you can work all the time anywhere, it doesn't mean you should. And so we're seeing challenges around burnout. Also, traditionally in a 2-year period, you may have been promoted. You may have been put on another team. You may have seen other opportunities that you're not necessarily seeing because you're not in the workplace. Now, that doesn't mean we have to be in person to do that, but it does mean that leaders need to be more intentional about looking across their organizations when they're identifying talent. We've seen some employees who were leaving because they wanted to do something a little different. We're like, you can do that here. And so unless you're telling them and providing those insights, it's very difficult for people to see that. And I think we've had other conversations about people feeling seen. And if they don't, someone else is offering additional compensation or different opportunities, how did you not see that within your own organization? So we're spending a lot of time in the leadership trying to identify ways that you need to use different skills and different tactics than we had done in the past. So I definitely see that we all were like, wow, this works. And how lucky we were as an industry, right? Compared to so many other industries, so difficult to navigate. And now we're like, okay, how do we get back? I'll end on this note. I thought it was fascinating when we first said you needed to work from home. I had so many of our teammates saying, I don't want to. And now we're like, hey, we love you to come back. We're like, oh, I don't think so. Right. I like this at home thing. So I do think it's an opportunity for us to take the best of what we learned in this, bring that forward, but really think through the shifts and changes that this had brought to us from a workplace management and really creating cohesive teams that can serve our clients, but we need to serve our people as well. So I think that's where we're at.
Thanks, Noreen. That makes a lot of sense in trying to find that right balance. And Rachel, I see you nodding around the COVID bounce. I'm curious how you've been thinking about this.
Yeah, well, I think that the research that Jenny was talking about really resonates. I mean, this is a case of necessity is the mother of invention, right? It's amazing how quickly organizations were able to react and respond to these vastly different circumstances. And all of those years that we've been talking about agile, and boom, we're all agile, right? And that was out of necessity. That said, because I think of everything going on, we were all probably really focused on those urgent issues. I think I was thinking this morning about kind of the beginning of the pandemic in February that we had a big stock market crash and we had no clue what was going to happen, right? And so and then we didn't even foresee this as being a long thing. How many times have we done the return to office thing over and over and over and over again, and different cities, different countries, whatever. And we all thought originally by the summer of 2020, we would be back. And so I think we didn't really start to think about these long-term issues like informal learning and mentoring until much later. And sort of, it's like the frog in a pot metaphor, right? So we were slowly boiling and we didn't realize the magnitude of the pandemic until it was too late. And so, as I already mentioned before with S&P Global, at least to some extent, we were already used to operating in this virtual environment. We were using cameras. I remember even working with people from Microsoft, and they always had their cameras off, but we always had ours on. But I think that the key to going forward is that we don't want to go backward. And that, I think, is what I heard from Noreen as well. Looking at all of our people processes and thinking about how do they play out in this new world, the virtual and physical workplace. For example, we're revamping our performance management approach. We've been doing that now for a couple of years, and we've been introducing a much more team-oriented way of thinking about performance and development. So personally, I think it's about accepting this so-called virtual reality and implementing it in a strategic and holistic way that's going to help us succeed in the future.
Thank you, Rachel. Cheri, how are you seeing these dynamics?
Well, I think Zoom wins out in COVID because as fast as I was very surprised that we were able to set up thousands of people at home so quickly, and decisions were made fast and productivity was great. And people actually felt a sense of camaraderie being home, having kids in the background and dogs in the background. What we didn't anticipate as fast as we went home, thinking as fast as we will get back. So Noreen and Rachel have said it well, that we've had to be a lot slower and prepare more than we anticipated. Some best practices, obviously, I'm sure most companies have offered extra wellness. We experienced people feeling psychologically burned out, even if it wasn't a productivity thing, it was sitting in the same room thing. And we offered a lot more and still offer a lot more wellness. We also did some things such as in the summer, we did no meetings after 2 on Friday. That doesn't mean if you want to work, but there was just no meetings after 2 to give people some kind of mental break. But I will say on a positive note too, the clients were in it with us. So, having the client meetings inside 4 walls of an institution was what you did. And now you have clients with kids in the background and dogs in the background. So what came of that, while it is very difficult to get back, everyone is having their own, whether it's logistically or emotionally or mentally, their own journey with it. I will say that our client contact and the ability to be flexible in different places and traveling and getting to clients has actually, we've benefited from that.
Interesting. Well, thank you all. So I want to follow up on a couple of the threads here. And in particular, let's talk about the middle managers. And some of you had mentioned wellness and burnout. And I think about the challenges of middle managers that came out from Jenny's presentation as well. They've always had a difficult task of translating executive level mandates and the corporate values into the day-to-day behaviors of the teams. And this hybrid work environment seems to have made that even more difficult. Or perhaps it's made some aspects of it easier. And this is what I'm curious to explore with you all. Rachel, I want to start with you. Do you see an evolution in the demands and expectations on middle managers? And if so, how are you seeing people respond to this?
The answer is a big resounding yes. If you think about, if you look at a map of like the roads and the transportation system in France, you see that all roads lead to Paris. It's the same thing with managers. All roads lead to managers. We call them, now we call them people leaders. We're trying to take a more people-centric approach and think less about sort of the management of the workflow, but more, having people in someone else's charge. And so these people leaders are overwhelmed with everything that they have to do. They can barely take care of themselves in all of this change. And they're then expected to take care of large numbers of people because we're still optimizing our operating models and creating bigger spans of control. And, so somebody might have to take care of 10, 12, 15, maybe even more in a highly operational environment of people at the same time. And they're dealing with the physical and mental health of their people and their families, death, right? During the pandemic, but they're not trained psychologists, right? And I think this is not dissimilar to what we're seeing like in the school systems where the teachers have become sort of all things to the children and the parents as well. So like we don't, there's so much stress and anxiety And we don't really have a strong support system in place, at least in the US, to like deal, to help people through these types of mental health issues that they're facing. So it ultimately, inevitably falls to the people leaders in our organizations. And that, in addition to really aggressive growth targets, right? So it's not like anybody changed the targets. In fact, in many cases, they increased the targets because everything was kind of falling apart, right? And so we, how do you deal with all of that stuff? I think it's a recipe for burnout on all levels. And so, in my view, there's a bigger question, which is around asking ourselves, growth at what cost, right? And how do we stop doing things, we do things around the edges, which maintain the status quo, right? And I think I mentioned during our prep call that we have these wellness days. Okay. So we introduce wellness days, and in many ways they're wonderful, because the best part about these wellness days is that we were having one a month, and now I think we have one every other month this year, where nobody is working, where, very few people are working, which means that you don't, it's not like a vacation day where you come back the next day and you have 500 emails. Nobody's sending emails, right? So that, that was a really great opportunity. And, we're giving birthdays off to people, which also provides a certain kind of, it's a celebration of the individual and of the person and of our humanity. I would just say that I'm just not convinced that we're getting to the root of the problem. Like, we're being thoughtful and we're being caring, but we cannot expect people leaders to continue to kind of deal with everything that comes their way, and I mean, just one other example of something that we've done is to recognize, for example, that people leaders cannot be great career coaches to every single person in this environment. And so we created a career coaching initiative where we hired 4 people full-time who that's all they do is career coaching in a confidential setting. So we're trying also to take away some of the extra, I hate to call them burdens, but because they're not really, but they become a burden because of all of the things that they have to do. So I think we really need to be very specific and figure out how can we separate this out so that people leaders aren't getting saddled, with everything.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I have the easy job. I get to ask the questions. Cheri, how are you thinking about the middle management challenge and all roads leading to middle managers?
Well, Rachel is correct that there is a different burden. I would say on my side, I see it more on the individual conversations, because now they're having conversations on introduce the topic of vaccination, and perhaps, some companies have different rules, and they are having to figure out if it is good for their people to come back or not. And then you get to the issue of fairness, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. I would say, in addition to some of the practices that Rachel shared, the structured days has worked for us, where we're saying, okay, 3 days a week, but, everybody comes in on Wednesday because that's our staff meeting. And I will say that the anticipation has been worse than getting back. So when we do the team pods and the structured days, it's like, oh my God, I got to do this. I got to get up. I got to wear the clothes I wore 2 years ago. And then they get there, and what they were missing from the human interaction, where humans at the end of the day, they actually came out and said, oh, wow, okay, I think I might miss this. I was just in Texas last week, and I had the group together, and I don't like to bowl, but we bowled. And we had a great time. And it was just the fact that we were socializing and crossing lanes and terrible at bowling. And it kind of made a stamp of like, okay, we can do this. We don't all need to go rush back every day, all day, but let's just do this with empathy. I think, Rachel, I'm not sure we'll get to the root of it, but I do think time will help, and maybe just a little by little. And we do offer support for our managers to have one-on-one conversations, and we give them a lot of guidance around how to handle those one-on-ones and group discussions.
Thank you. That's very helpful, practical tactics. Noreen, are you seeing the middle manager challenge in your space as well?
And we definitely are. And I think Rachel said it well when we're talking about having that manager have too many things to do. They are not, in most cases, trained human resource professionals. They weren't trained to be a career coach. They can provide anecdotal notice depending on how experienced they are. What we know is that, so what we've done is made more investments in our HR function. You know, again, when you think of the intellectual capital at your organizations is really a very valuable asset. And this is a time by which you really need to think about having people who are professionally trained, who this is their job, who make an effort to help coach and train that next level of management, especially the new management. And, you know, what I have actually seen other organizations do, and I think it's worked really well, is they've revisited their core values. Taken a moment to revisit their core values with their larger teams to better understand what do their employee base looking for, what are our teams looking for, and creating an opportunity for creating just a little more connective tissue there. Mm-hmm. But I do think the managers at the end of the day really are that, like we said, the contact really from that, the digesting the, what's happening at the senior leadership level to the ground, and how are we really making that work? Especially when you've onboarded new employees in the past. I mean, a lot of time has gone by when we think about 24 months in our industry. That's like a lifetime in a lot of ways at home. And I also would agree with Cheri on getting people back. I have 2 millennial workers in my home. Actually, they're not in my home, but I see them happier as professionals going to work. One much happier than the other. The other one was complaining about her commute. But I'm like, Emily, you've got to be with your team. You got to interact. And I think those experiences there are important just for that connective. And honestly, 24 hours a day on Zoom or on email isn't really what we're looking for. The organizations that take a moment now to think about what 3 years looks from and really ensuring that we're not taking growth today to really, as a forfeiture for the future, they're going to emerge stronger. And so I'm very optimistic that we'll do what we need to do to get that done. But it is a difficult time, and especially given all the emotional challenges that we're all facing in this current environment.
Absolutely. And I share your optimism, particularly as I think about how carefully, deeply leaders are thinking about these issues. I'm going to ask one of the follow-up questions here from the Q&A and chat feature. What about training for recent college grads? And this is for anyone on the panel. There was mention of additional learning and development opportunities and emphasis on HR and generational dynamics. I'm curious about any panelists who might have a comment relating to recent grads.
I don't know if it's anything new, but I can speak for JP Morgan. We have a very robust 2 different tracks, graduate school, undergrad, where we bring in not only interns, but rotational programs that are 8-month, and you can rotate through different businesses. In fact, we encourage no 2 stints in the same business. That helps younger professionals come in out of school, learn different lines of business in this financial industry. We have a lot of those, and we have them we have them in business and finance and communications and marketing and technology. Every single facet of our organization has its own rotational program. So I feel good about us doing that. And, that I would just offer that up as a best practice.
And Cheri, just as a follow-up, you've been able to maintain the rotational programs through the hybrid and work from home environments. Mm-hmm. Okay, absolutely. Any other panelists want to respond to this one?
Maybe just a quick add for me. I think this goes back to what I said earlier about really fundamentally kind of working through all of what I would call our people processes and taking a more strategic approach, because we know that this kind of, at least we're going to have a hybrid, right? So we're going to have some virtual, some in person, and being very intentional and purposeful about how we construct these types of experiences to make them as meaningful as possible. I do a lot of coaching as well. And I know that, it used to be before the pandemic, nobody would want to coach in virtually. And there were very few studies that were done around that. But I also know how effective coaching has been virtually. So I do think these things can be very effective virtually. Probably more of a combination, but they need to be intentional and well thought through and grounded in research.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to our next topic around organizational fairness. So given that there's been a range of working models, some from mandatory in-office days to more of a do as you feel appropriate and being able to be mindful of individual needs, this raises a number of questions relating to basic fairness. Some people might consider it fair that everyone is treated the same way. Others might consider it fair that each person is given an opportunity to work within the limits of their own constraints. And these questions are really coming to a head in the workplace in ways that I don't think we necessarily have had to manage in years past. So how are you all thinking about that in this new working environment, particularly because I think these elements of fairness extend beyond just the remote work arrangements, but also relates to compensation or distribution of projects and other reward systems, and who feels that they're being seen and heard in the workplace. There's just very multifaceted elements of organizational culture that relate to basic fairness. So Rachel, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, sure. So I would say that at the individual level, fairness is very tricky because the research generally shows that what is fair to one person might not be perceived as fair to another. It's a very subjective, very kind of individual, contextual topic, right? And so there's always this element you have to personalize in order for people to perceive something as fair. At the organizational level, the biggest risk I see with respect to the virtual kind of environment, and we talked about things like informal learning and mentoring, stuff like that, is then you introduce the whole discussion around cognitive biases. And so you've got like, there's the Neuro Leadership Institute has this model they call the SEEDS model of bias, and the D stands for distance, as in closer is better than further away. And so, and going back to what you said, Azish, before about how you've got, different cultures have different ways of living, so that people from certain, certain groups might have multiple generations living at home, and therefore they, could put certain people, elderly people, at risk if they go into the office. So we've got to figure out how to do that. We cannot demand that everybody goes back into the office and kind of create a one-size-fits-all approach, because it will inevitably be a challenge. But it's almost like you've got this ethical dilemma there, because on the one hand, if you bring everybody back, you're not meeting the needs of some, but if you're not bringing everybody back, then those people who are not coming back might be negatively affected. And so again, it's figuring out, how do you get to the point where you can navigate the virtual and the physical in a meaningful and well-balanced way? That's at least my best guess at this point.
Absolutely. Lots of ethical dilemmas embedded in there. Noreen, how are these dynamics around fairness showing up for you?
So I think where it starts with, we had an imperfect model before. The good news is we're at least paying attention to it now, right? So the model we might have had before in terms of fairness, and again, I agree with Rachel, is like it's an individual bias, right? How you consider what's fair and what's fair to my coworker, not understanding why they're getting a certain benefit that you're not getting, not really, because we weren't being as transparent as we needed to be. So I think transparency and communication in this environment is so important, and words matter. And things that I might have said before that were perceived in a different way in this current environment where people are a little more, maybe exhausted, it could be the word I would use, that they're more sensitive to the different things that we might take casually. So being careful. So fairness really starts with identifying what's the role, what does the role get paid, how do we career track, what are the skills required to be successful in the role, and communicating that out, which helps. And whether you need to be, this role requires you to be in because it's client facing and that's our expectation. This role doesn't require that, and giving choice for those that have a different challenges around that. But I think the reality is, well, we've taken a lot of take a step back, and like the model we all had before was imperfect. And we thought we were trying to be fair, and fairness wasn't always getting done. But now we're like, we acknowledge now it's not fair. So let's ensure that as we get through this other side, that we come up with a model, and we're going to have to continue to evolve and refine it. So I do think it's around creating transparency, open communication, and then, and communication being a two-way street, actually hearing. You know, sometimes we communicate out, we don't communicate. Let's take that input. So is that input from the, anyone who's getting the work done. So I think that's a part of the model that we're looking at. But I do think we're challenged by this, and I don't know if anyone's come up with the right solution, but I'm always interested in hearing. So if anyone ever does, please let me know.
I love that perspective as well about the journey and the fact that we're focusing on it now. So there really are opportunities to think about organizational fairness in new ways. Cheri, how are you seeing this evolution?
I think Noreen said it best. So I'll just give you one brief point. We were already dealing with fairness issues, as Noreen said it. She called it an imperfect model. That hasn't changed, just the topic has changed. So we are now met with a new topic. And if I may, there was a question that came through, which I think was a really good challenge. Why does JP Morgan want to have everybody back? Well, everybody is a strong term for me because we have over 200,000 people. So I can't really speak for that. But I would say where we are now, and I'm going to speak from Cheri's point of view. We are a people business. And yes, we can do a lot of things virtually. We can do a lot of things digital. And a lot of that has come over the last 2 years. But right now as a business, we still believe that there is benefit in human interaction in addition to all the great digital capabilities. That doesn't mean for every single human being. That just means as an organization, as me speaking as a leader, there's benefit. Rachel mentioned, does the virtual stuff work? It does. I have found places where it doesn't. And an example of that is I happen to run the financial advisor training program for our wealth business here. And we have found challenges training advisors on Zoom. Yes, they're here, but when it comes to role playing and actually practicing, people get a little bit more shy on the camera than they do. And it's funny because they're sitting with clients all day long, but this camera factor has really impacted them. And I just learned this thinking, oh, we're still here. Let's just turn our videos on. They're not used to that. They want to go into a breakout room and they want to do a role play with a smaller group. And even though we do these breakouts in Zoom, that's not working. So I believe in my whopping 44 years that we are at a point right now where we need both. And that is kind of where we stand. I think I could speak for organization, but for me, that's where I'm at.
Absolutely. I appreciate that perspective, Cheri. I think having both is an opportunity for us. And Jenny, I want to turn to you on this organizational fairness as well. I know you've done a lot of research relating to it. How are you thinking about the balance of these dynamics?
Well, to build on the point that Noreen was making earlier, we're considering at the FSCB how organisational justice literature can really help us to understand the sort of multifaceted nature of this. So if we think about fairness, it's really helpful to think about how fairness happens and how justice happens. So if we think about it in terms of the outcomes, maybe distributive justice, where you end up, there's an element of fairness around the outcome of each individual employee relative to any other one. But there's also fairness about the process. So procedural fairness can be really, really important. People don't necessarily hate the outcome if they think it was arrived by a fair process. So sometimes you can have an output that somebody dislikes, but a fair process to arrive there, and they will therefore respect it, irrespective of how it impacts on them. And the last one's this idea of interactional justice. This is about how we listen to each other and about how we communicate. And so if we think about the impact of that on outcomes, then again, if people are heard and they're considered as individuals, and if they feel like they have had some kind of input into it, then we can actually get people to respect the outcomes that you've arrived at by these processes. So I think it's quite useful for organisations to think about it, and we're going to be doing some more work on that over the next few months.
That's a really great perspective. I appreciate your sharing that, Jenny. And as a lawyer, due process speaks to my heart as well. And I think that many people do think of fairness as a fair process, and that even if the outcome does not really look like what they had in mind at the beginning, as long as they were treated ethically throughout a process, and there was these elements of transparency and diligence that other panelists have mentioned, that could equal fair in their minds. So we have 4 minutes. We have a lot of questions, certain ones on the outline that I didn't have a chance to get to, but I'm going to have the moderator's prerogative here. And I'm going to focus the last question on compensation and give you all an opportunity to talk about the dynamics that you've been seeing in terms of compensation trends in the industry, and one of the questions we received around the Great Resignation. I think that could tie into the compensation trends that we're perhaps seeing. And there's been so many headlines about these trends in the industry, particularly some where we're seeing that some firms are accelerating deferred compensation into upfront cash awards. In one instance, I read as much as 60% of those awards have been accelerated. So my question for you all is, how are you in an environment where inflation is going up, demands for compensation are going up as well? How are you thinking about that in balance with the Great Resignation and what we're seeing on the employee retention side? Noreen, let's start with you, please.
Sure. Thank you. I think the compensation challenge is one I think most of us are feeling. Talent is at a shortage. We need to, again, how do you attract and retain the talent, and just counter, we're coming in with counter offers as opposed to saying, I see you. This is what the role pays. This is how we'll get you there. We want to partner and get ahead of that conversation. What's the career pathing, but being paid fairly, again, with the current inflationary environment, is truly a challenge. And people talk. One of the things, I think, a little generationally at this point, compensation, that was something wasn't spoken about. Now, pretty much they're sharing. So if you're making an opportunity and you're making a change for one employee, again, this is where transparency matters and communication is important. They're going to find out their coworker. So yeah, just go on in there and ask for a raise. So how do you do that? So it's more than about the money. It's more about what's the opportunity set. But we have to be aware that, the traditional raises that were happening in the past or bonus models are not working for where we are right now.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. It's more than about the money. Cheri, how are you seeing the compensation trends interact?
Same with Noreen, and different job families or different job families. And I still believe that I can't replace flexibility in pay. I can't swap those. Yes, I can adjust, but there is a market pay for certain jobs. If I could give anyone some advice in my old ex-HR days, what's happening in Noreen, I can't believe how much people talk about compensation now. They look over and they're like, oh, my friend Noreen, she makes this much. I have the same job, or maybe I'm better than Noreen. I should make this much. And I've been telling people that everyone has made a set of decisions in their life where they've taken jobs, either right time, right company, big break, that no one path looks like the other path. So maybe Noreen and I started at the same time, but we had different jobs along the way, or we made different decisions for our life. So what I would just tell anyone listening, that I wouldn't start comparing amongst your friends until you really look at their life choices before that, because it's too hard to do that. Otherwise, you'll never win that battle. You'll always find someone that's making more than you. So that's my words of wisdom.
Thank you, Cheri. And Rachel, the last word on this, and apologies, we're crunched on time.
Okay, I'll keep it short. I would say that I know that companies are making an effort to combine purpose with profit. And I guess compensation obviously is important, and you have to make sure that you get the comp right, especially in the financial industry. However, I have two young adult sons in the workforce, and I know that they are not doing what they do, and they are both working in fintech. For fintech startups. And they know that they're doing this because they want to make a difference. They want to have an impact. They want to learn. They want to grow. So you can pay them all the money. That's not going to draw them to a job. So I think we also need to really start to fundamentally think about how do we help people find much more meaning in what they do. And I'm not sure that the purpose and profit thing is enough.
Thank you, Rachel. Finding meaning in work, I think, is a great place to end. Clearly, much more to talk about on this topic of the future of workplaces. Thank you very much to Jenny and the Financial Services Culture Board for the fantastic research that kicked us off on this discussion today. Thank you, Rachel, Noreen, and Cheri for being fantastic panelists. Thank you again. I'm Azish Filabi with the American College of Financial Services Maguire Center for Ethics. We hope to do another one of these panels on workplace culture and particular behavioral science later this year. So please do keep an eye out, and we look forward to engaging with you on these topics in the future. Have a great day.